ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Hey there, just before we get into today's episode, have you heard that Richard and I have announced a national tour? Conversations Live will be coming to a theatre in your capital city in August, and we'd love to see you there. It will make you laugh and maybe make you cry, a little bit like an episode of Conversations itself. Tickets are on sale now. Just go to the Conversations website to find out more. Peter Godwin was born and raised in Zimbabwe. His parents had moved there from England right after they were married. And when the family lived in the Eastern Highlands, Peter's mum was the only doctor for thousands of kilometres. Civil war broke out when Peter was a little boy, which meant that he was sent to boarding school and then conscripted by the army while still just a teenager. Peter studied law and made a career as a journalist, including many years spent as a war correspondent. As the years went by, he came to learn more about his parents and the true story of how his family came to be in Africa in the first place. At the end of her life, Peter's mother came back to England, and she and Peter had the kind of conversations they never really had the chance to before. Peter's latest memoir is called Exit Wounds. Hi, Peter.
Hi.
Tell me about the landscape where you were born, the Chimanimani Mountains. What are they like?
You know, in a way, they don't conform to anybody's stereotype of Africa. You have the stereotype of acacia trees and kind of scrubland and whatever people think of as Africa. Chimanimani shattered all those stereotypes. It was very well watered. It had a high rainfall and it was high altitude and it was verdant and rocky and wild. Very beautiful, but not in a kind of archetypal African way.
So your dad was working running farms. He was an engineer. What about your mum? What work did she do in Rhodesia, as it was then called?
So my mum was really the only doctor there. So for something like 2,000 square miles, she was the only doctor. She was the government medical officer, and she did absolutely everything. So whatever was wrong with you from birth to death, and I mean death, including autopsies and postmortems and things, she was it, basically. And so I used, as a kid, to sort of go around with her on school holidays and things, and saw, when I thought about it later, far too much. I just saw everything. It put me off being a doctor, that's for sure. But it was an incredible, childhood that I only sort of realised afterwards, and the way that one does, because the way you grow up at the time, you have no context, so that's normal for you. And the further I got away from my childhood, both chronologically and geographically, the more I realised it was very strange.
What kind of manner did your mum have with patients? What do you remember noticing?
My mum was something that you don't see enough of these days. She was a great narrative diagnostician. So she couldn't send blood samples away and have all sorts of machines, and, in the way that medicine is now. It really wasn't that technical. So she had to elicit symptoms out of people. And really, what I now realize, what she was really good at doing was making people feel comfortable. And often when you're talking about intimate symptoms, it's embarrassing. It's really embarrassing. And people will lie. They'll lie, especially in cultures like the Ndau culture, the local culture there. Telling a stranger the most intimate bodily functions, it doesn't come naturally. But she somehow had this way of being completely unjudgmental, of putting them at their ease, and it was an amazing skill.
Was medicine a vocation for her, Peter?
It absolutely was. And I must say, she was a very good doctor and she was good at many things, but it came at the expense of motherhood, and she would be the first to admit it. Being a parent wasn't of enormous interest to her, and she made no bones about it. She told us she had this other thing to do, and she had all these people who were relying on her, and we just better make the best of it. And I do remember, one of my first memories of her as a mother was her kneeling down and so that she was sort of eye level with me, and I must have been 3 or 4 or whatever it was, and saying to me, "Listen, I need you to be a big boy. I need you to be grown up and sort of independent and be able to look after yourself. I haven't got time to be worrying about you." And of course, as a little kid, you want to do that because that you think that's how you get your parents to love you. And there's a sad symmetry to my relationship with my mother insofar as I spent the first 10 years of my life trying to get her attention, and she spent the last 10 years of hers trying to get my attention.
That sort of steely focus that it sounds was in her when it came to her work. I mean, I guess that partly would have been required just for a woman of her generation to even qualify.
Absolutely. She had qualified at St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, which is the oldest medical school in Britain. And her year was the very first year they let women in. And they didn't let very many of them in, and most of them didn't survive. I mean, they didn't survive the course because they weren't welcome at all. And what was interesting is that as soon as she qualified, they went out to Africa. And it was a very macho kind of pioneering society. You know, women were treated as women. They were sort of second-class citizens in a sense. But when she put on a white coat and a stethoscope, she suddenly transcended gender, even among that kind of rough and ready sort of pioneering society. And there was a certain, she had a lot of respect. I noticed that.
Your mum carried out mass vaccinations in your part of Zimbabwe and over the border in Mozambique. How did that pay dividends for you years later when you were reporting on a guerrilla war in northern Mozambique?
So it was quite interesting. She would do these vaccinations, and the colonial boundary there between Mozambique and Zimbabwe cut straight down through the Ndau people. And so they were on both sides of the border, and there was no real border marking. They moved back and forth. So to try and achieve herd immunity, which is what you're after with vaccinations, she would send word to the chiefs on the other side of the date that she would be doing the vaccinations and tell them to send their people across, which she shouldn't really have done technically. And they did. And as a result, they did get herd immunity. And a few years later, I was covering the civil war in Mozambique, and I was kidnapped by Renamo guerrillas from the Malawian border and taken to their headquarters in Gorongosa. And I was being fairly roughly treated. The whole thing was getting a little worrying. And eventually I was presented to the kind of commandant. And he looked at my passport and he saw my name, and I saw him look at my name, and he said, Godwin. He said, was your mother a doctor? And I said, yes. And he said, did she do vaccinations and things down in Chimanimani? And I said, yeah, absolutely. And he rolled up his sleeve to show me his little vaccination mark, and he said, she vaccinated me. And then suddenly I went from being a hostage to an honoured guest.
It's just extraordinary. I mean, extraordinary that he remembered her name. It must have been such a rarity, or she would have made such an impression that he carried that.
Yeah, and she was, she was singular. She was a white woman doctor. This was not a normal thing.
Oh, thank you, Mum, in that moment, I think. Your parents had 3 children. Where were you in the sibling lineup?
The middle one, the difficult one, and the only boy, for that matter.
How old were you when you were sent to boarding school, Peter?
I was so young that they had to get special permission from the Ministry of Education because it was illegal to send children that young to boarding school. I think you should only have been sent at 7 or 8, and I think I don't think I quite turned 6. I think I was 5 when they sent me. And what had happened was the Zimbabwean war, the war for independence, kind of went in several phases. And an early phase in the 1960s had happened in the Eastern Highlands where we were, and our next door neighbour had been murdered. And we had to drive 35 miles along difficult dirt roads to get to school as a day school, and it just wasn't feasible anymore. So they got special permission to send me to boarding school early, and I hated it, obviously.
I was thinking when I was reading your description of boarding school about the scene in Roald Dahl's memoir, Boy, where he describes being a little boy in the dormitory at boarding school and he'd sleep facing the direction of home. The homesickness was so awful. Is that what it was like for you?
I did cry myself to sleep pretty much every night, and I drew. We had this little metal lockers, thin, narrow metal lockers, and I did one of those prison calendars where I put and I crossed out each thing to the day we would have what was called an exeat weekend, where your parents came to visit you and you were allowed to go out with them just for the day. And so I crossed them off, and I didn't see them for, the intervening months. And then on the day that they arrived, I had secretly packed my suitcase and sort of ran to the car and dragged it and threw it in and said, thank God you're here. It's awful, take me home. And it never occurred to me that once they knew how unhappy I was, that they would let me stay. I thought, I just need to survive till then. And they said, I think my dad said, "Oh, it'll make a man of you." And my mum said, "There's no alternative." And, sorry. And so they brought me back and decanted me with my suitcase. And it's one of those little moments where time stops. And I can remember all these decades later, I can absolutely remember everything about that moment. Their old Austin Westminster, the way the tires crunched on the gravel, the brief sort of glow of the red tail lights when my father braked, and them driving away. And, I never really trusted them after that. And I remember just thinking as they drove away, you're on your own. You really just have to figure this out on your own. It only occurred to me, really, when I was writing this book, I was going back to that period, that I could go for weeks without a one-on-one conversation with an adult.
With an adult? Any adult?
Any adult.
What do you mean?
We were just in a class and whatever. There was no individual, it was a small school and everything, but I became sort of emotionally feral in a way. And then from then onwards, I was just in boarding schools further and further away. I was just in uniform the whole time. The schools got further and further away. They got more and more Dickensian. And then I went from that I was conscripted, so I was still in uniform then. And so, in some senses, I only really re-met my parents as an adult much later on. It was an interesting process.
When you were reading back through letters that you were sent home from time at boarding school, you saw references to pills. What was that about?
So that was a real shock to me. I didn't really believe, people say you block something out, and I thought, well, I'm sure you don't block it out completely or whatever, but I really, until I read those letters, I had no memory of this. So when my mum died, there was a box full of the letters that I'd sent them from boarding school from the very beginning. And you can see the first ones are done in pencil and sort of wobbly writing, and then eventually they become cursive and they'd go to ballpoint pen, and you can just see. And I'm looking at these letters and I have no memory of writing them. So these letters become letters from myself, my childhood self, across the decades to my current adult self. And the letters from me are all they start out saying, "When are you going to come and get me?" and blah, blah, blah. And there are very few back from them. And when they just sort of say, "The horses are good and dogs are doing this," and they're sort of rather bland. And then I came across letters from me talking about Valium, the tranquilizer, antidepressant, whatever, and saying, "Please send more Valium, please send more Valium. I'm running out. I'm having to cut them in half," and whatever. And I went back and I had no memory of this. I'd blocked the whole thing out.
What sort of age was that, do you think?
About 10 or 11, I think. Way too young to be on that. And, I only really revisited it when I started having children of my own. And my boys were born and grew up in Manhattan and had as diametrically opposite experience of youth, of boyhood, as I had had. And I remember when the older boy, at sort of 14 or something, started on his own looking up boarding schools online. And I was like triggered by this and going, "Oh no, why do you want to go to boarding school? Don't go to boarding school," with this sort of terrible Dickensian stuff in my head. And I was talking to a friend of mine who happened to be a pediatric shrink, telling him the story. And he listened patiently to me. And when I'd finished, he said, "All very well," he said, "but just remember to parent the child you've got and not the child you were."
Oh.
And I do think there's an element, that you want to you fantasize the lost object and you want to go in and fix the childhood you had, which is in its own sense a little narcissistic or solipsistic at least. So I kind of backed off after that.
You mentioned there in passing, Peter, that your life in uniform continued after boarding school to being conscripted to the army. What age were you when you were brought into the army?
17 when I was conscripted, and then 18 before I was deployed. And what had happened was that white liberal families, of which we were one, so my parents didn't support Ian Smith, and they didn't support the UDI, the Declaration of Independence.
This is colonial Rhodesia.
This was colonial Rhodesia, and Britain wanted to hand Rhodesia over to majority rule, and obviously the majority was black. There were never more than about 250,000 whites out of a population then of about 10 million. But what you could do, and what liberal families like mine did with their boys, with their sons, was that if you had a place at a university outside the country, you were allowed to do that first and defer your conscription, and then you were supposed to come back and do it. And of course, those sons wouldn't come back. And that's what I was planning to do. I had a place at university in England, and just before I was about to go, they changed the law and said, there's a manpower crisis, everybody has to do their conscription first. And I was grabbed, and that was it. And so I ended up in the war as an 18-year-old.
How long were you fighting in that war?
I mean, I did, all told, more than a year, 18 months, somewhere around there. I can't quite remember now. But it wasn't really the amount of time. It was the intensity of it. Because I did, in the end, end up being in combat and being in the sort of teeth of the war as essentially, looking back, really as a child soldier. I mean, all I wanted to do was sort of stay alive, basically.
So by the time that was over, you were still, 19, 20. What kind of change were you as a young man by that point, do you think, after such an extreme experience?
I don't know who I would have been, who I should have been, because that really did something to me. I mean, I know that it changed me. I came out of that really different. And you never go back to that innocent default. You just don't. And I found myself feeling sad and feeling, that I would like to have met that person who I would have been and should have been. And instead, once you've done that kind of military service and whatever, it stayed with me. It was a footnote on my resume. When I went into journalism and things, people said, well, why don't you go and cover this conflict? You've been a soldier, you've been in wars. And then I sort of did, and then, became a sort of reluctant war correspondent. I would have rather been the opera correspondent or something. So it sort of defined me in ways that lasted so many years afterwards.
You did manage to go to England to study and were at Cambridge. What kind of culture shock was that?
I mean, I just didn't know what was up and what was down. I really didn't. The whole of my first year, there are long bits that I can't even remember. I think I was just trying to get through it. I ended up getting a job in a local psychiatric hospital, like a bodyguard. When the patients were attacked, we were supposed to sort of and I used to work nights and weekends there. And one of my jobs for part of the time was to strap people in for electroshock therapy. And I was making enough money, but I was so tired, I was falling asleep in lectures and things. And so the staff said to me, well, there is a guy here who is a patient who had been a law professor years before. And when he was lucid, I would literally physically sit at his feet. And he would say, well, what are you doing this week? And I would tell him. And he would give me these extemporaneous tutorials. And I would just write them all down, blah, blah, blah. And I would turn these essays in. And my professors would go where are you getting this stuff? I mean, it's kind of brilliant, but dated. And I would just prevaricate and whatever. And he got me through my first year. So my first year at Cambridge, I was really taught by an inmate in a psychiatric hospital. The tutorials would end when he would imagine himself as characters in history. So he would suddenly become Mussolini or Churchill or something. It was quite a good mimic. And then I would pack up my books and realize, okay, that was the end of this tutorial.
When you were at Cambridge, Peter, there was a terrible thing that befell your family. Early one morning at college, you got a phone call from your father. What news did he have?
That my elder sister Jane, who was 7 years older than me, and in many respects she was the stalwart of the family. She was the kind of person who kept us all together and arranged everything, and was really the foundation of the family. That she had been killed together with her fiancé and best man less than 2 weeks before their wedding. They had run into a Rhodesian ambush and had all been killed. And really, for our family, there was just before and after that, just everything changed after that. My parents went from being kind of vigorous, young middle-aged to just the light. It's like a switch was flipped and the light went off behind their eyes. It really did. And, we were that kind of English-type family. We found it hard to emote anyway or talk directly about our feelings. We never hugged or told each other we loved each other or anything like that. We didn't do that. And when I wrote my first book, Makiwa, it became this object that I could triangulate and I could talk to my parents about my sister's death through through the book, because it was somehow, we weren't just talking about it directly. I was saying, well, I'm trying to research the book and did this, and it was the way, more than 10 years later, that I managed to start a conversation in the family whereby we could at least try and process the loss of Jane.
As you're describing really this series of incredibly brutal experiences, from the boarding school to your time in the army, in a ward, the murder of your sister, and then as you mentioned that you find yourself putting the role or taking on the role of being a war correspondent, so right back into the heart of the very worst that people can do with one another. When you reflect on that time, on those years, you talk about the moral injury involved in that kind of work. What does that term mean?
When my marriage ended after 25 years, only then did I deign to go to therapy. And, again, I come from a tradition where we don't chat about these things generally. But I did finally, and because I was living in New York where everybody seems to go to therapy, there's no stigma. And when I went to therapy and talked about the divorce and stuff and whatever, but the more that she found out about my background, she was saying, my therapist was saying, I think you've got PTSD. And lots of the symptoms I could cop to. But the one thing that didn't quite seem right in the diagnosis for me was that PTSD, often you go back to one thing that happens. There's one traumatic event and you keep reliving it and whatever. And that wasn't the case with me. It wasn't one particular thing. It was just a whole accumulation of things, of just seeing so much violence, of being intimately involved in violence for many decades and just being ground down by it. And then reading around, I came across this thing called moral injury, which is sort of this idea of burnout, of seeing, and it happens to trauma surgeons, and it can happen to cops, and it can happen to war correspondents and people, that you just see this bad side of human nature too much, and it just grinds you down. And when I read the symptoms of all of that, I thought, that I recognize. That's something that I can see that in myself, absolutely.
It's an evocative term, moral injury, because it kind of reminds or underlines the fact that there's a wrong being done. It's something that you're observing that you don't have the power to stop. Is that part of the injury of that term?
Yeah, it is absolutely, and it does something to you, and it breaks something inside you when you see these social codes, or whatever you want to call them, being broken, and injustices being done, and terrible violence and things, and often unpunished, unconsequenced, and that kind of thing. I mean, there is this whole idea as a foreign correspondent or as a conflict correspondent of bearing witness. The problem with that is that what can often happen is that you tend to exaggerate your own power to amplify. Certainly in Zimbabwe, when I look back over all the reporting I did on Zimbabwe, which for me was a very personal story, there were very few times that I could discernibly move the needle on anything. I felt bad that I talked to witnesses and survivors who talked to me in the hope that I could stop something. And I mean, in the Matabilan massacre, which was one of my very first stories, which I did some of the very first reports on these terrible massacres in the south of Zimbabwe after independence, shortly after independence, I probably came closest to helping stop something, at least before it had run its course, than I'd ever done before. And that propelled me into journalism and sort of set me on that trajectory, I think.
How informed did you keep your parents about the details of your life during those years?
I mean, we followed a sort of Clintonian gaze in the military policy where it was sort of don't ask, don't tell, at least in real time. There was no point in saying, oh, hi, I'm about to go off to Somalia or Sudan or something. I mean, just what. But once I would write the reports and I was out of the area, I would tell them and then they would know. And they were pretty stoic about the whole thing. I mean, even the Matabilan massacre, which is what my first big story, which put them in some danger in Mugabe, Zimbabwe. And before I went down, I said to them, this could get sticky. Are you sure it's okay? And they had not a shadow of hesitation. They said, no, you do what you have to do, and you absolutely should do it. It's interesting, when my mum, much later, when my mum was in hospital in London and she was dying, she said to me that there was something she needed to get off her chest. And what had happened was I'd been in Somalia covering this terrible refugee crisis, and people were coming over the border from Ethiopia and dying in great numbers. And while I was reporting it, I caught all the diseases they had, and there were no drugs, and I got terribly ill, and I sort of got trapped there. And I ended up in intensive care in a Nairobi hospital. And for a while, I was extremely ill. But I recovered. And when I recovered, I spoke to my parents, and that was all I knew. And now my mother was telling me, she said she actually got a phone call from a doctor in Nairobi saying that they had me there, but they thought they'd got me too late and that I probably wouldn't survive. And if she wanted to come and say goodbye to me, she needed to come up. And so she was in Harare, I was in Nairobi. And this is my mother, and I'm at her deathbed now, just lying, and then she said, it was quite expensive, the flight, which really wasn't. She said, quite a long flight. It's not. It's like 3 hours. And she was saying, and I was very busy at the time. She said, long story short, I didn't come and I didn't tell your father. And what she wanted was absolution from me. But in order to get the absolution, she was having to do it to me for the first time. Because
you had no idea that she had this phone call saying that you were on your deathbed and she should come.
Exactly. So she had to sort of commit the sin in order to get the absolution. And I was sort of furious about it. And I thought, the punishment for this crime is inbuilt, which is you have to deal with it on your own. You can't actually share it with me because you're doing it to me for the first time. But of course I said, oh, it's fine, don't worry. And then I was telling my younger sister, I was sort of blowing off steam and saying, I can't believe, this is what Mum said and this is what she did. And Georgina listened to me patiently, and then she said, yes, but she said, how old were you in Somalia when that happened? And I went, 27. And she said, that's exactly the age Jane was when she was killed. She said, it's one thing for a mother to be at one child's deathbed, but at two, it's just too much. I felt so ashamed. I said I was seeing it all from my point of view. And suddenly when Georgina flipped the lens like that, I went, oh God, of course.
Peter, after you left for England and then New York, Zimbabwe was becoming a failed state under Mugabe. Your parents were doing it hard. They'd lost their savings, their pension had become worthless, but they steadfastly refused to leave Zimbabwe. You were back visiting them when you saw an old photo up on the wall of your parents' place of people that you didn't recognise. What was the story?
So my dad had had a heart attack, and my mum thought he might not survive, and she said to me to come up. And he did, in fact, survive. And when he came out of hospital, he put this photograph that you mentioned, and it was a sepia print of three people, a young middle-aged couple and a little girl stood between them who was 10 or 11, who was obviously the daughter. And I said to my mum, who are these? And he said, you have to talk to Dad about it, and whatever. Anyway, I did talk to my father about it, and they were his parents and his sister. And now to meet my father, he was a quintessential Brit abroad, striding around the bush in a safari suit and desert boots and a walrus moustache and a kind of emotional force field round him, speaking in a clipped British military accent. He was sort of quintessentially British. And what he told me when in explanation of the photograph was, in fact, he was a Polish Jew, and all his family had been killed in the Holocaust, and he had been stranded in England as a 14-year-old who went there for the summer to learn English. And it was 1939. It was the summer of 1939. He was supposed to go back on a Baltic steamer on about September the 5th or 6th. And on September the 1st, Hitler invades Poland. His family can't get out, and he can't get back to see them, and he never sees them again. And they end up in Treblinka, in concentration camps. And so he joined the Free Polish Army, had a very, very active war. I pulled his war records. He was in combat the whole time, battled the Bulge and all manner of things. And after the war, he stayed in England. He couldn't go back. Poland was in the Soviet bloc, and went to university. And he still had a Jewish name then, and he was still Polish. And he met my mother when they were both at university and in London. And my mother's father was dead by then, but when my mother's mother realized that something romantic seemed to be going on, she pulled my mother aside for the conversation and said, my father was then called Casimir. I knew him as George. And she said, listen, I don't mind you showing Christian charity to Casimir, but just remember, we don't breed with these people.
We don't breed with
And my mother said, well, I think you'll find I'm going to breed with whomsoever I please. And when they did get engaged and married and whatever, she was essentially disinherited and cast out and whatever. So they went to Africa on his side, everybody had been wiped out in the Holocaust, and on her side, they were anti-Semitic. So before they went to Africa, my father changed his name to the male name on her side of the family, Godwin, and when he arrived, he never talked about it again. She knew, my mother knew, she was the secret keeper, but nobody else suspected, including us, the children. We had no idea.
The most extraordinary thing to find out. I mean, had your father told you about a different family, or he just didn't mention his relatives, or?
So the interesting thing is how families can train children not to ask certain questions or go to certain places. Sure, I said, what do you do in the war? And he would, but lots of people don't want to talk about the war. But I remember once, having to get a passport and needing all his details, or his father's details, and he was born in Warsaw. I said, why were you born in Warsaw? And he said something like, oh, my parents were in the Foreign Office, or they were on business, or something, had some sort of flip thing, and that was it. But it was clear he didn't want to talk about it, and it was so you just sort of didn't go there. And much later I realised, I now can't remember the actual words, but I remember thinking it was odd because he spoke in such a sort of meticulous way, but there were 5 or 6 words that he unaccountably mispronounced, and they weren't that difficult, but the emphasis was on the wrong syllable. I thought, well, that's odd. Why? And looking back now, there were little signs, but I didn't see any of them. And it's really something to be reintroduced to your own father. I was, by then in my early 40s, had children of my own. And really, he said, I'm not who you think I am. I'm someone else. And he reintroduced himself to me. And now realize, looking back, that they had, they had no money and whatever, nothing. And I think I'd already written one book, and I think he gave that story to me as a legacy, the only thing he had left to give me was this story.
It's so interesting, because I was about to ask, why do you think he kept that secret your whole life? Why would he have decided to tell you?
The keeping a secret initially is obvious in the sense that people who, you needed one grandparent for Hitler to send you into a concentration camp. So I understand the sort of the urge to protect us from that. But you're right. Why then tell me? And the only thing I can think of is that, he and the weird thing is, in Makiwa, my first memoir, it didn't have any of this. In fact, it had stuff that was wrong because, about my dad, because I didn't know any better.
How did it change your sense of yourself to discover this? Not just about your father's story, but by virtue of your story as well.
So I think my sister Georgina expressed it best. She said she thought it was like if you were adopted and didn't know it, and somebody suddenly told you when you were 40, actually, your biological parents come and say, honestly, honey, sorry, we're not your real parents and whatever. That insofar as nothing about your lived life changes. It's all the same. But what changes is the perspective from which you view it is suddenly different. And for me, that's what happened. I mean, I'm a late onset half Jew, but down the male line, which isn't the real line, it's the maternal line that matters. I'm Jesuit educated, I'm already in my 40s. It's sort of, and I've already got enough identity issues to be getting on with. White in Africa, in a minority rule country, and living in England, and now on my third continent, and now we've got the whole late onset Jew. It was like, oh my God, how many other things can we have?
Did it change your relationship with your dad? I mean, the way you were describing that taciturn, stoic approach to fatherhood, which was partly of the era, but I guess he was also very carefully hiding himself on a very deep level from you. Once he was open about this truth, did it shift anything in the dynamic between you and him?
Yes, I mean, I think it made us slightly more open with one another. But the mistake I made, and I won't make again, was I didn't realize that once somebody tells you something like that, you don't have carte blanche to sort of go rifling through the story, that I had to renegotiate access every time. I mean, what happened was I got some of this information face-to-face, some by email, some, and he was very careful about it. And it was so sad because the first thing he asked me to do once he told me, he said, could I do a Red Cross search? Because he'd never got death certificates. And I think, honestly, I think there was like a tiny little percentage of him thought there was just, maybe they survived, which of course they didn't. They went into Treblinka, and those eastern concentration camps, they were human abattoirs. There are no memoirs coming out of Treblinka. Your average stay is 6 hours. There's no accommodation. It's just, that's what it is. It's just for killing. It's a killing factory. So, and he was talking to me about it, and I had a notebook downside, and I was jotting things, and he suddenly rounded on me, and he said, all you do is scribble, scribble, scribble. And I never wrote anything in front of him again. And so you had to be excruciatingly sensitive about the way that you approached it and whatever. But the more he spoke about it, that it did become more fluent. And I like to think, maybe I'm kidding myself, that he seemed a bit lighter afterwards. I think he just, by unburdening himself and by not, because, the amount of emotional energy it takes to keep a secret like that for so many years is enormous, and how lonely that must be.
And it sort of suggests a particular kind of relationship that he and your mother must have had. That's an incredibly strong bond between two people, that one of them knows the other's secret past.
So much so that as kids we used to feel like they had this marriage, there they were, and we were off to one side. It's like we weren't really part of this. They were so reliant on one another. They really were, and almost to the exclusion of us.
Your dad asked you to ensure what would happen to his body after his death. Can you tell me what that meant?
So he never really asked me for anything in his life. I mean, he never, and the last time I saw him alive, he said to me that would I just make sure that he was cremated? He wanted to be cremated. He didn't want to be buried, whole, as it were. And when I went back after he died, I was sort of so busy trying to organize the funeral and one thing and another. And then once we'd done that, I started looking at the cremation. And there's really only one crematorium in Harare, in the country, really. And they said, oh, no, we haven't had gas forever. And Zimbabwe's failed state and whatever. And so I tried to source gas, and I tried to import it. There was absolutely no way. Couldn't do it. And I felt so bad. It's the one thing he'd asked me to do, and I now wasn't able to deliver. So I became really determined. I just sort of became obsessed with somehow doing this. So I went to the local Hindu pundit, the sort of Hindu priest, and said, listen, can you help me burn him on a pyre? And he said, no, we're not allowed to burn white people. He said, we got in trouble for burning white people. He said, you have to be a Hindu now to be. And I said, and he said, was he a Hindu? And I went, no, he wasn't a Hindu. In fact, my dad, so he said, well, and I begged him and eventually he said, well, I mean, he could convert. And I said, well, he's dead. And he said, but we're Hindus. He said, no, we have... we believe in reincarnation. So he said there is a workaround, So he basically said, I said, well, okay, I'm happy for him to convert. And so he did some various things and did some rituals and whatever. And he said, okay, now he's an honorary Hindu. So, and I just thought what was so funny about it is my father, born a Jew, then had masqueraded as kind of Church of England his whole life, but then died a Hindu. And I think he got most of his bases covered here, for his afterlife bases. But then, of course, I then said, okay, well, where can I deliver his body? And he went, oh, no, the oldest son has to do it. You have to do it. I said, I have no idea how to do this. And he said, well, I'll give you an assistant who can help you. And we went out to this old cemetery, Pioneer Cemetery, where the Hindus had their pyre site. And it was like a huge soot-blackened, the ribs of it were blackened crib that on wheels, on rails, on a little rail. And you put all different kinds of wood and different orders of how it burnt, and then the hearse delivered the body in a kind of aluminium thing, and it was swaddled, and we put it on top and lit the fire, and then you eventually push it into a kind of kiln, and then wait all night while it burns, and then bring it out. But of course, what you get after that is not fine white powdery stuff that you get from commercial crematoria. It's much coarser than that. And I mean, there's something about my sense of mortality. Your sense of mortality will be enormously increased when you look at your father's femur in the bottom of the thing. And much later, we left some of the ashes there, but we saved some of it because we wanted to put him with Mum eventually. And when my mother died, Georgina went up into a cupboard and there was the rest of Dad's ashes, which was in a kind of supermarket bag and whatever. We brought it down and we wanted to commingle it. And so she got a plastic funnel to put, and so we were trying to do this and I was pouring Dad's ashes into my, and there was like something hard in it and I couldn't figure it out. And then when I poured it out, I realized they were his teeth.
Peter, I think that is the reality of death that most of us
don't see these days. It's also antiseptic. People die in hospital. I mean, and I noticed, for example, at the end, when Mum died, when people were sending condolence messages, nobody wanted to use the D word. They didn't want to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, your mother's dead." They said, "passed away," or "moved on, gone to a better place." All the euphemisms. And Georgina and I started collecting them, and we had this competition of all the euphemisms, and there are dozens and dozens of them.
Which do you think is better for grief, having experienced both the literal having to burn your own father's body and the more antiseptic way of dealing with end of life?
I mean, there's something very visceral about seeing it in its biological reality and not having a buffer, not having it all euphemized and sort of out of the way. I mean, it was very jarring. It was extremely, it was distressing, but in some ways, the finality of it is, and you see why these rituals are so important and why they're universal across the world and in societies. We all have these funeral rituals and things that it is so important.
Your mum spent the last 10 years or so of her life in London living with your sister Georgina, who helped care for her, and you'd visit back and forth from your home in the States. I mean, as you've been describing it, it was a complicated relationship with your mum. You admired her, you see this incredible good that she did for the world, and there was a sense that you were on the outer emotionally, really, from the very beginning. What kind of relationship did the two of you develop in those final years of her life?
So when my mum turned 90 and she was living with my sister in a sort of downstairs room, which we divided with an office kind of partition, three things happened almost simultaneously. She suddenly started speaking in the voice of a stranger, and her normal voice was sort of what the Brits call received pronunciation, RP. It's kind of upper middle class, BBC-ish, what the BBC used to be.
Posh but not comical.
No, yeah, exactly. And actually only about 6% of Brits actually speak like that. And now my mum suddenly started speaking this very haute Edwardian drawl, and it was just like, yeah. And I was like, oh my God, but why are you talking like this? Even the Queen has brought it down a notch. And she denied that her voice had changed. She said, I've always talked like this. And it was just, and Georgina and I were just, we couldn't believe it. And the second thing that happened was that for no good medical reason, she took to her bed as though she were prematurely lying in state. And she bought one of these big hospital hydraulic beds, and she pressed this sort of control panel whenever you went into her room and brought the bed up to its full height, and the back also went up, so she could peer down at you in Solomonic judgment in this haughty voice. We nicknamed her the Empress Dowager and called her Your Grace. And the third thing that happened was that, having been a doctor all her life and whatever, as you might expect, she was incredibly diplomatic and conflict averse. And she suddenly lost all her filters and she became like a giant toddler, and she would just say whatever came through her mind. And often it was incredibly rude and splenetic and offensive, mostly about me. But it was very funny as well. And she did have a really good sense of humour and could take the mickey out of herself. But she could also suddenly remember poetry, all of this sort of pre-war British canon of poetry, and she would suddenly start spouting poetry, and I became like a poetry Shazam, trying to sort of figure out this one. And one day she'd been doing all this poetry, and then she was lying in her bed asleep, and Georgina came in, and we were talking about it, and I sort of half-jokingly said, maybe we should do an anthology of all the poetry she can remember, and we could call it Poems to Die By. And my mother, without bothering to open her eyes, because it turned out she wasn't asleep, corrected my grammar and said, poems by which to die.
What on earth was the accent shift about, do you think?
My mother did actually serve with the Queen in the war, in the Wrens. At the very end, so the Queen gives these annual speeches to Parliament and things. And so linguists have been able to follow her accent all the way back. And they see it changing, the Queen's accent, as she makes it more accessible and brings it down a notch, literally over the years. But then just at the very end, when I was doing this book, is that they found the very first audio recording of the Queen when she was still Princess Elizabeth and she was only sort of, 12 or 13 or something. And at the time, British kids in London and other cities that were being bombed were sent away. They were sent to Australia and South Africa, Canada, to the countryside and whatever. And this was a recording of Princess Elizabeth on BBC Children's Hour talking to these kids. And they'd found this recording and you could click on it. And I clicked on it. And Georgina was in another room and this little voice came out. And Georgina came running and said, "Oh my God, that's Mum's voice." And the voice that my mother reverted to was the voice that she had used as a young child. And it was the voice she'd used up until her father had died.
Mm-hmm. In time, your mum goes from being at your sister's place to needing to be in hospital. Tell me about the matron who cared for her there.
Not just the matron, but many of the staff who looked after my mother in what was the biggest hospital in London, University College Hospital just off the Marylebone Road. Many of the staff there are black Southern Africans, but especially from Zimbabwe. And my mother's retirement job, the last job she did, was in charge of staff health at the biggest teaching hospital in Zimbabwe, the Parinatwa. And she had tended for a lot of these people in that capacity. And now here they all were in London. None of them wanted to be there. They would really prefer to be at home, all these thousands of miles away. And they were looking after her. So she got really very good care. And in those last days, it was interesting. She knew she was dying. And she summoned me close to her. She said she wanted to tell me something. And her voice was getting quite hoarse by now. And so I got closer and she said to me, "I want to tell you something." She said, "I find you don't annoy me." And then she paused and she said, "Most people do." And that was as close as she could get to saying that she loved me. And when I tell people this, they say, "Oh," she said, "what?" But I knew what she meant. That's how we did it in our family. That's as close as we could get.
And from the way you've described your mother, I imagine not annoying her, that is a great accolade. I'm fearful that should I have come into her presence, she would have found me most annoying. So I would definitely take that in the spirit with which it was intended. This is your third memoir, Peter, as you've mentioned. How does writing about the past change the way that you remember it, or does it have that effect for you?
It's a very interesting question. I mean, I don't usually endorse the idea of writing memoirs as therapy, as some kind of therapy, because I think it doesn't necessarily work that way, and sometimes you can end up italicizing things that you'd rather forget. But I'm very interested in this book about in the way memory works and how it is a sort of fairground mirror and how it distorts things and how some things in your memory are bigger than they perhaps were and other things are smaller. But your memory is who you are. Your memory of your life is who you are. And as one gets older, a strange thing happens, which is that though your childhood is getting further and further away chronologically, it starts to get closer as you get older. This is a very common thing. Elderly people can remember their childhoods. They can remember everything that happened about their childhood, but they can't remember stuff that was happening, today or yesterday. There's something about it that's a natural thing. So, in a way, in Exit Wounds, that's what I'm interested in. So it's not a forensic book. I'm not re-researching everything at all. I want to look at it through the prism of memory. Mm.
In many ways, it's a book about loss, the loss of your mum, of your elder sister, of the loss of your marriage, the loss of various homes in multiple continents. What's most present in your life now?
What really happened, I want to call it a midlife crisis, but I'm too old to be able to do that. So it's whatever crisis that is. I had what the Queen would call, in honor of my mother, an annus horribilis. And my annus horribilis was three things, the three pillars of my identity, three important pillars, all wobbled at the same time. My 25-year-old marriage flamed out. my mother died, and my kids grew up and left home. And I looked around and I was in New York, 1,000 miles or hundreds of thousands of miles away from wherever on my third continent. And I suddenly thought, who am I and why am I and where do I belong and where is home, and all of these huge big things came flooding back into me. And so the book is really a kind of meditation on all of that, which affects a lot of us, but also an added thing in Australia, which is, a lot of people here are from somewhere else originally, if not this generation back one or two. And this idea of exile, or, this idea of a malleable identity that you're not quite sure, who you are and where you fit in and who your tribe is and does it matter and all that kind of thing. So the last bit of this book, I think, is a love letter to New York, which is, a maddening city in many ways and so difficult to live in and, cacophonous and whatever. But it's not, I think, an accident that people like me end up there, because it's full of people like me.
Listening to you talk about your life, Peter, and reading your book, it seems that one of the continuities, something that has remained despite all these other losses and changes, is your relationship with your younger sister, Georgina, who's the only one of your family left from your childhood. Tell me about that connection, because it seems to be really at the core of who you are.
It's a really interesting sibling relationship, because the truth is that because of the age difference and because my parents had moved from the rural areas into the city by the time that Georgina was growing up. So she never spent a day at boarding school. She didn't, and my older sister made sure of that. So she had quite a different childhood to ours, although she grew up, in the latter years of the war with all of that insecurity, et cetera, et cetera. But she and I were very seldom on the same continent. Once I was an adult, I was away at university, and then when she was in London, I was posted abroad to South Africa and various other places. We were hardly ever on the same continent. And so in a sense, we met properly again as adults, and even now we don't live on the same continent. She lives in London and I live in New York, but we have a very close relationship, and we've had such an extraordinary background and had such eccentric parents and whatever, and she's the only one who has lived it in parallel, and so we have this bond. I mean, we joke and say that the reason we get on so well is that we never live in the same place. So we don't want to stress test it by actually living in the same place. And really for us, a lot of it is to do with humour, that with each other we can be completely unedited and we just sort of go for it. And I think we are both essential for the other's mental health.
Peter, it's been a fascinating life that you're living, and fascinating to hear just some of the stories from it. Thank you so much for being my guest on Conversations.
Thank you for having me.
Podcast, broadcast. This is Conversations with Sarah Kanoski.
Peter Godwin's latest memoir is called Exit Wounds. This conversation was recorded on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples. The producer was Jennifer Leake. Our executive producer is Nicola Harrison. I'm Sarah Kanoski. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Sarah Kanoski. For more Conversations interviews, head to the website abc.net.au/conversations.